Well, it's a pleasure to have you here, and I am delighted that you stumbled upon this story because it would be easy to say, oh no, I'm not going there. And I imagine you may have had a few moments during your research where you said, uh-oh, how do I get out of this? I don't know if you ever had those dark nights of the soul that they talk about, but let's just jump in with how did you get from making the biopic to this book? And it's an interesting microcosm of when you're making a film, you're kind of discovering something, you're like, uh-oh, what was the telltale? What was the twist?
Well, I thought it was going to be a wonderful movie about Jerry Cobb, the astronaut candidate in the 60s who fought for women's rights. And this was just going to be such a positive and heroic story that I was going to, make my mark. It was before Hidden Figures, which many may have seen that film. I was working with Jerry before that with, that would have been representing another group of hidden figures, Jerry and 13 other women, 13 including Jerry, called the Mercury 13, who fought to be astronauts when basically only men and chimpanzees were allowed to be astronauts, not women. And I so respected her journey, so I was there to tell a very positive story. As I tell in the book, I was visited at, I thought it was by accident or by happenstance that I met a woman in the Department of Defense who was in espionage. What an interesting profession. It was the first person I'd ever met who was a spy, or in espionage, as she put it. And she didn't say what agency, but she did say Department of Defense. She was in the war on terror. At any rate, this woman started to give me warnings about the movie with Jerry, which had nothing to do with this happenstance friendship. And that caused me, and I'm really accelerating through a story I tell much better in the book itself, because that's how I start the book, tell the story of her warnings and how it was her warnings that made me simply start to wonder if Jerry had, because Jerry was back in the day at the Cold War, and Jerry had a lot of access to secret facilities and top secret clearances and all that. It wasn't a really big stretch that Jerry herself could have been in espionage. So, I did the dumbest thing. I just Googled Jerry Cobb and CIA together, right? The capital A-N-D, which gives you whatever that is going to bring. And I'm going to read a little passage because what that brought up was a woman named June Cobb. So, and that's exactly how I started this little section. What came up was a woman named June Cobb. I had seen her name before while researching Jerry on the internet, but I'd never clicked on it. This time I did. The search paragraphs were filled with gibberish. Subject lines like HSCA, CIA, Segregated Collection, Box 40, that made no sense. I waded deeper. More gibberish. These were government documents. Something to do with the CIA. Something to do with assassination. Something to do with the Kennedy assassination. I read on. Whoever this June Cobb was, her name appeared in thousands of pages of government files that were part of the investigation into Kennedy's death. The documents were dense, incomprehensible at first. I groped for a paragraph that made sense, that actually said something concrete, and slowly a picture of June emerged. Her full name was Viola June Cobb. She was 3 years older than Jerry. She was a blonde, like Jerry, but a CIA employee. She was an agent. She knew Fidel Castro. This woman was interesting. She had evidently worked in Castro's office as a translator while she was spying on Fidel Castro. Who was this woman? And then with a few clicks of my mouse, I knew. June Cobb was from the same hometown as Jerry, Ponca City, Oklahoma. She was the same height as Jerry, same weight. June had also lived for a time in Jerry's other hometown, Norman, Oklahoma. She was in the Civil Air Patrol, so they were both in aviation. Both were fluent Spanish speakers, both had lived extensively in Latin America, both left home in their 20s for South America, and then the point of no return. When I saw that June Cobb lobbied on behalf of the indigenous tribes at the Amazon headwaters, the same Andean mountain people to whom Jerry had devoted her entire life. That was her life after she left the astronaut idea of the program. Both women had visited that isolated region in the early 1950s when almost no white people had ever been there. both advocated for causes relating to the cocoa leaf chewing habits of the natives, and both had exited the jungle from their youthful expeditions, burdened by a lifelong jungle-borne disease. Now consider for a moment the chances of any family allowing their college-age daughter to travel to the Amazon to contact indigenous people in the 1950s at a time when early expeditions were reporting that the jungle was riddled with cannibalistic headhunters. And that was the thinking then, by the way. What was the statistical probability that two girls named Cobb, of identical description and similar ages, would be involved in aviation from Ponkin and Norman, Oklahoma, both in the Civil Air Patrol, both being Spanish speakers, both traveling to that remote tribal region and then leaving with a jungle-borne disease, while also being involved in top secret US government programs? I quickly imagined those odds were about as good as two people sharing the exact same DNA, which I now suspected they did. So that's my moment of discovery. And that was really the moment where my life, if your life changes in an instant, there are those things, births, deaths, and, graduations perhaps, but this was right up there.
There are other authors, journalists, filmmakers who tell a similar kind of story of they stumble on something, they think they're talking about or researching one topic. And I
Right.
think of the journalist who was profiled in American Octopus on
Mhm.
Netflix.
Right.
And he thought he was telling one story just
Yes.
about early software programming
Yep.
for the State Department. And then it was not that anymore. And
No.
anybody who's written about MK Ultra, the book called Chaos, uh, we were talking about Annie Jacobson earlier and
Yeah.
her work on Area 51. You are in the company of people who know how to do research, who made a dedicated effort to understand something, but had to have on almost a reckoning with, wow, this is not at all what I was prepared to do.
Yeah, and you mentioned the genre and the various authors in that genre, and of course, it was not a genre that interested me. I had not spent much time on spy films or even known that much about the JFK assassination. I think I knew what the average American interfaces with the documentaries. We flip the channels and maybe one's on, maybe we watch a little bit of it, or maybe we've seen Oliver Stone's film. I wasn't enamored with that world. It seemed to me to be something so far away and distant, and I just never thought I would intersect with it. And I wasn't fascinated with it, and I'm still not, despite what I've written in this book. I mean, I don't see myself as a conspiracy person. I don't subscribe to the many theories that are out there about many, many things. I did come to believe that there was, I mean, when you when you're working with someone for 2 years, which I was working with Jerry to tell her story in the movie, for 2 years. I was interviewing the woman. She was an elderly woman at that time in her, I think, late 70s, but quickly into the 80s. And she was becoming more frail. I believe she may have been actually older than her stated age because physically she always seemed a little bit older. So I think there's some question there. But yeah, it was to interface with a person who is cloaked with a possible double identity is just something I never thought I would ever come across. I've since learned that they're not that rare. Criminals use them, of course, but Witness Protection Program uses them, and the clandestine arts use them rather, liberally to hide their agents as well. So it's not something that's impossible to come across. I would have thought it was just almost like, seeing a unicorn, basically.
And I think also there's this, if that's not a part of anything you were interested in, there was probably a lot that you needed to learn. And then when it's connected to JFK, there's almost, for some elements of the public, the eye roll that scrapes the ceiling, and a question of, oh no, you're not doing that, are you? You're not let's get our pointy, our tinfoil hats out, and you're trying to maintain a credibility and saying, there's something here. Did you
Well,
find yourself struggling with that?
I did, because I wasn't interested in probably like a lot of Americans, when I'd seen some things, I thought, oh, there's something odd there about the JFK assassination. They talk about the magic bullet. You've heard all the theories that bandied about. And it seemed like, to me, I think the biggest thing that I would have questioned prior to even learning this is, Oswald never made a lot of sense. Why did he want to kill Kennedy when he was supposedly also advocating for Castro, when the thinking was maybe a Democrat would be a little bit more open-minded to Castro versus the hardliners that he might get if Kennedy were out of there. So that never added up. And then you go to the lone nut theory, but he was actually very organized, and there were just things about him that didn't quite add up narratively, but I didn't really give it much thought. And the tinfoil hat thing, I mean, my book's called The Woman I Know. I stuck to what I know, right? I knew this woman, and when I confronted her about being June Cobb, she placed herself at the scene of the assassination, at least not directly at Dealey Plaza, but at Redbird Airport, in a story about trying to escape in hours after the assassination to get the heck out of Dallas. It's a direct conversation I had with a person I knew, right? A woman I know. That's why I gave it that title. I'm trying to stick with what I know, which is I knew her. I know what she thought. I sat and heard that story. That's in chapter 1 of the book, for a really important reason, because when she told me the story about being in Dallas that day, right? And her story didn't completely add up, but it was so incredibly visceral. The part about escaping, so now imagine these facts. I'm profiling somebody who by the way, invested money. I have investors for my films. A very legit process is underway to cast the film. I mean, it was pretty far along when I discovered that she appeared to have a double identity, or whatever that looked like, right? So imagine you're dealing with somebody who's hiding something like a double identity. And I should say that June Cobb, the double identity, is a spy who has 10,000 documents in the Kennedy assassination documents. So June Cobb is in that saga. Her double identity is in the Kennedy assassination documents. So I didn't seek that out. That's where the double lady is. And then when I confront her about all those strange facts, she places herself at the scene in a really suspicious and concerning way. So that is what led me. Not that I'm sitting wearing a tinfoil hat, and at first I was really looking into it because for the film investors, for my crew, I had people working to tell the heroic story that I set out to tell, not some wild double identity story about the Kennedy assassination. No, I wanted to tell the heroic tale, but that is not what I found. And I pulled the plug on the movie because I didn't feel that it was on solid footing if she was hiding a double identity of a person mixed up somehow in the assassination saga. And then it became my quest to, okay, that's a whole lot of things that are being hidden. Why? I should also mention, Patricia, really important piece of information. Presidents Biden and Trump don't agree on very much. But those two presidents agreed that there are 3,000 to 4,000 Kennedy assassination documents that can never see the light of day now. They must stay away forever. And guess who's in some of those documents? Good old June Cobb is in documents that are continually withheld. From here to President Biden, very sane person, decided that something about those files can never see the light of day. Trump had at least given it a date that it might come out. May he kick the can. Biden said, nope, we're not even going to give those a date anymore. They're just not going to see daylight. Those are some June Cobb documents. So, there are a lot of reasons to kind of wonder what's going on with her. And many of which we get in chapter 4, 5, and 6, we start to see what it is about June Cobb that we're not allowed to know.
Right. And that's so the trajectory of the book is fascinating, and I don't want to give anything away, because one of the best things about your book is the arc of this character moving to something that by the time I got to the part, and I'll just say this, and we can put a period at the end of it. you're served something that I believe had strawberries in it.
Well, I'm not really afraid of spoilers, to be honest with you.
Oh, okay. Well,
But I
I'll
can,
just
but I
tell the
will.
audience.
Mhm.
Okay, if this is a spoiler, if you need to go get a glass of water, go get a glass of water because I was worried for Mary.
Mm. Well,
Okay, Mary, set the stage then if you're not worried about that.
well, I think, we were jumping way far ahead in the story
Right.
towards the end of the book, but, obviously I'd launched a large investigation into Jerry, the woman I'd been working with to tell her story, and who she really was, and also who was this June Cobb and what has June Cobb done in her spying work. And I think it's important to actually lay a little bit of groundwork before we get to the strawberries, which is that June Cobb, which I found out in her documents, she was involved in what certainly appears to be assassination related deliveries to try to get rid of Fidel Castro, which our country was trying to kill him, to get rid of him, the CIA specifically. And June Cobb is the person, I found 70 some documents where June Cobb was sending in deliveries to the chosen assassin. The agreed, this is not tinfoil hat at all. This is agreed upon stories heavily looked at by other historians, but those historians didn't spend any time in the June Cobb file to learn that how involved June Cobb was in the assassination program that our country had in the Cold War, right? She was working for William Harvey, the head of the program, and she was the contact who had, the line into the guy that we enlisted to give poison pills to Castro. So that places June Cobb in an assassination program. That combined with Jerry's story about being in Dallas, all these things are just more troubling, and more troubling, right? Then I'm dealing with the woman. Then I learned there's something, I'm investigating her and she kind of knows it because I've very directly confronted her about some things about being June. I told her I didn't believe her completely, that she claimed not to be June, but did so in a very odd way, as you'll read in the book. So anyway, there's something called, which I looked this up at the time, fraud detection homicide. If you're uncovering a fraud, a person who is a con or has done illegal activities, and you're going to out them, you are at risk, right? Because get rid of you and you get rid of the problem of theirs being outed. And I was worried at times about investigating Jerry as openly as I was, going around. And in the book, I made a very explosive discovery. Jerry was supposed to have no money. She was supposed to have, devoted her life. She got a Nobel Peace Prize nomination for devoting her life to these indigenous people at the Amazon jungle. And I was unspooling that as to a great extent, a fraudulent claim. That was where my research was leading. And Jerry was supposed to have devoted every penny she had to this cause. And I uncovered that Jerry had, a huge valuable collection of pre-Columbian gold antiquities that she was selling at Sotheby's, and she was selling all sorts of places. She had tremendous wealth in the form of gold icons, right? And it's just that this sounds so
Inca
off the.
and Maya, this has got to be taken,
Well,
you
and
know.
and this is again, there's no tinfoil hat. You can Google Jerry Cobb and pre-Columbian gold right now, and pieces will come up that said provenance from her collection was right hiding in plain sight. But I eventually found some auctions, and I visited an auction house. Jerry, she was okay with me asking questions about her being June Cobb. Where was she the day Kennedy died? But when I stumbled on the gold, that seemed to upset her, and I could tell that it upset her. And she gave me a warning, which I write about towards the end of the book. Right after she let me know that she knew that I'd stumbled on this gold antiquities value that she had, she said to me very directly, and my partner was there, heard it too. I was visiting her house, and she said, "What hospital do you go to?" And I was like, "What?" And she's like, "What hospital do you go to?" And I'm like, who asks you that? Like, not even a doctor, but hospital? I don't have to go to I'm pretty healthy. I don't have to go to the hospital all that regularly. But I told her which one I kind of would go to if I had to. Within 48 hours, I was at that hospital after eating a meal that she served me. So, and I had some food poisoning that was very aggressive. And I was in the hospital for 3 days, basically very, very, very ill. And, it's very hard to prove where things came from. But, I felt and my doctor, we all, and my partner, I mean, we already knew that I may be in some danger, right? But if she laced my food with something that had made me sick, um, I think in her world that was more of a warning than a true attack that wanted to get rid of me. I think
Right.
that would be more of a, you know, a warning, a shot across the bow, because
Right.
it
It's not like Putin. It wasn't like a
not going to kill
Putin-esque
me. Yeah,
move,
yeah.
Navalny
So that,
kind of
but I
thing.
hesitate to discuss. I mean, here we are discussing it early in the discussion, but that's such that's a big claim and it's a wild story. I think it falls better towards the end of the book where you have understood how much I've unspooled about her, how much of a con, and how meticulously I was going after, and very importantly, what the alter ego June Cobb had done. Right, that's the important part of it because June Cobb was involved in some of our darkest operations that our country was performing in the Cold War. And that is interesting in and of itself. Let's say someone doesn't believe what I've uncovered, that maybe June and Jerry aren't the same person. Why has June Cobb been overlooked to this extent? We're talking about notorious people and stories of history. Man, oh day, June Cobb is interesting, right? She is a woman in 1960 who is on our, the tip of our spear of our Cold War program, which is targeting leaders. I mean, she was taking on risks. We can all debate the ethics of it. And I grew up as a Quaker, so I'm no fan of assassination programs in any form. However, if you're looking at women, well, I initially looked into women being the equal of men in the astronaut program, which is what I thought Jerry's story was going to show us. And I wound up learning about a woman who was the equal of men in an espionage setting, and specifically in a setting of covert action, and how beneficial it could be to be a woman, to be cloaked in the guise of a woman, or you are a woman, but you're taking on roles that just were not done by women in 1960.
I think one of the unique elements of your story and the uh, hospital question, where it is important because I've read few books in even the true crime or in the history genres where the author who is, and you're in the story,
Yes.
but is in jeopardy. And I wanted to highlight that your trajectory and that of
Mm.
June Cobb, Jerry Cobb,
Well,
are
it
are are fascinating because people may not know what somebody's capable of, and you become the person who is the exemplar of what
well,
she may or may not be capable of.
what is so interesting though is I was worried about her, but she at the time was very elderly. So to say you were afraid too was really, you looked a little wimpy there because, she was in, by the time of this strawberry bowl, which is how I believe the suspicious meal came, she was probably mid to late 80s and seemed older. I mean, really
Right.
looked 88, 90, and to be fearful of someone at that
Now,
age.
Mary, you've seen Arsenic and Old Lace. Come on.
Yes, I
Come
have.
on now.
But you tell your friends, what's going on, and actually all my friends believe me. I've had like a long and pretty credible career. So as I was fearful of telling some people, my inner circle,
Right.
and when I went to the hospital, and I had to say, hey, you have to look for something bad, like, in my blood work. Don't just, I was interviewing, I had to say that to the doctors in the emergency room. Of course, the diagnosis would have been, a natural element, which would, of course, be how they would do something, right? And putting a natural, spoiled water on something that would easily sicken you, but not kill you, but make you real sick. Um, so yeah, but you do look wimpy. But everybody believed me because luckily I'd had in my 60s now. At the time I was in my 50s. I was well known in the area. I'd done films for the hospital that I was checked in. They knew me people in my area know of my reputation. I was at one time on television in my region here. So luckily, everybody knew I haven't spoken about crazy things before.
Right.
So that served me very, very well.
Let's talk a little bit about Mexico City,
Mm,
because I think that one of the elements of this story that's so interesting is really the international scope that it takes. And also, and that's of course these political assassinations, Operation Mongoose, and the decision in the Cold War to take assassination seriously as a tool, as a tactic, as a part of a larger strategy to maintain dominance in the Cold War. So I have found that Mexico City, even though we know that Oswald was there, it kind of gets overlooked. And I don't know if that I don't know why. You may have a position on that, but put us in the why was
mm.
Mexico City so important? What was going on there? And how did it really connect to Jerry Cobb, and what the US was doing?
It's so interesting, and I do. One cool thing I think about my book is because I went in as a newbie. If a reader is a newbie and doesn't, is like, I'm not into the Kennedy thing, I'm not into spying, I don't know anything about this. You'll go in and learn with me, right? So I talk through. My naivete is front and center, but I learn, Mexico City is a great exemplar of that because I would have thought that the cool spying jobs would have been in Moscow, let's say, right? Or Havana, and June Cobb was in Havana. But I would have thought Mexico City would be like a super boring place to be if you were a spy in the Cold War. Why be in Mexico City? It's kind of an ally. It's too close to us to be in the action. Why be there? Well, what I didn't understand was really how spying works, that an awful lot of spying, well, we kind of see it today, what goes on with misinformation, propaganda wars, people trying to win ideologies. And, our country was trying to win over for capitalism and democracy, win the war of ideas in Mexico City against the communists who were also, and in a place like Mexico City, the KGB could have an embassy. And they'd be all your spies are located in the embassies, right? I didn't even know that. That's another basic. We house them in our embassies, and the enemy's house theirs in their embassy. So you have a Moscow, Russian embassy, and you have the Cuban embassy there, and then we have the American embassy. Now, we were shut down from directly going to those countries, traveling and stuff by that point. So where are we going to mix it up for our spying, right? It's hard to get in and out of there. Well, places like Mexico City were hotbeds. And not only that, but they were fighting for the heart and soul of Latin Americans, for them to either jump on board with the allure of capitalism and democracy, or win over, communism, fighting for, the little guy. I mean, whatever their argument would be. And that was that was the largest CIA station, or one of the largest in the time period. And that's why. So, of course, Lee Harvey Oswald made a very, very strange and problematic trip down to Mexico City. June Cobb was stationed in Mexico City for, the crucial years for spying after she left Cuba. And Jerry told me she spent a lot of time in Mexico City. Interesting, right? And Lee Harvey Oswald made a fascinating trip down to Mexico City. But another thing I learned about spying is the class of people that are getting spied on, and the class of people that are spies are a really interesting class of people. They're actually all over, like writers, professors, intellectuals, of course, the scientists and engineers, yes, but they're very much into, I don't know about today's spying, but if you're good at messaging, right? So even filmmaking, I would imagine, where if you've got a megaphone and you're swaying people, that is a very interesting milieu for spying. And so publishing, actually, back in the day, and I'm sure things have changed, but back in the day, there's a tremendous amount of involvement on literary magazines, for example. Heck, I would think bookstores in Mexico City was where some of the people were, the spies, case officers were meeting people. I mean, it was definitely in these circles. So when I looked into some of June Cobb's contacts and people she was dealing with, like Elena Garro, a wonderful writer down in Mexico City, I went and looked in her things, right? I didn't know that much about Elena Garro. You've studied her. But when I was in her box, I pulled out a photo of Elena Garro with Pablo Picasso, and they're just hanging out. This was in her personal collection, you know. This is the kind of circles that the spies were circulating in, right? So it was fascinating. And I had no idea that Mexico City was this fascinating, but obviously I do now.
I want to encourage our audience, if you have a question for Mary, you can post it in the YouTube chat or send it via email to virtualqa@malaprops.com. Mary, you have another part that is called your book called Eclipse. Do you think you could read a little bit from that
Well,
and preface it for us?
I had to just go see the total eclipse here in the one that just came across our country, and maybe some of our listeners have also just done that. My book ends with, I think it's my best writing, if I do say, it's where I could really just describe. The book is structured so we sometimes are, it's sometimes describing my cat and mouse relationship with Jerry, and me trying to get information out from her and find the truth, and her breadcrumbing me with some details. She and I began to travel the world together, and she took me to June Cobb's, spy stations, and we did travel to Mexico. So we've gone many places, but our very last trip was to see the total eclipse of the sun. And this was the end of our relationship, actually. It was the last trip I took with Jerry. Not because anything happened to our relationship, but she was just fading as, just aging out of an ability to travel. So I'm just going to jump into a part of this chapter, which I think I'm most proud of. An eclipse is nothing if not a perfect circle. She mentioned it so often I wondered if she was hinting for me to go, but didn't want to ask. When I feebly suggested that seeing a total eclipse might be kind of fun, she canceled her plans with her other friends, if she ever had any, and plotted our course to totality. I'd never seen a total solar eclipse, and Jerry had never seen one from the ground, she said. Of course, she had a plane, so there's that. There was nothing she loved more than planning a trip, and I'll give her credit. She dialed this one into perfection. Gone were her concerns about costs, perhaps because she knew this trip could be her last. The plan was for us to meet up in St. Louis, stay a few nights, and then drive to the home of Amelia Earhart at Atchison, Kansas. There, she knew of a little park where the eclipse could be seen in all its glory from a secluded hillside that had meaning to her. Jerry wanted to arrive days in advance to scout out the viewing spot, and so we went with Ruth, that was her partner, and to this little park near Amelia Earhart's home. Jerry had outdone herself this time. The park was an oasis on the prairie. It had a curving walkway like the yellow brick road made of pavers bearing the names of famous aviators and astronauts. The path meandered through an arboretum of exotic trees native to all 7 continents, including trees from George Washington's Mount Vernon and Eisenhower's Gettysburg estate. The park was dedicated to the aviators who had made possible every corner of the earth, and to the astronauts who had strode across the moon. Jerry's name was etched onto a paver near the entrance. Jean Pearson's paver, that was June Cobb's CIA case officer. Her paver was just around the corner. In the middle of the park was something not wholly of this earth, a tree more akin to a poem than a plant. It was a moon tree, raised from a seed that was hand-carried by an astronaut to the moon and back, and then planted in this soil. What a glorious place from which to watch our moon pass before the sun. From the start, this trip seemed like an ending. I'll hold it there, but that's just a little, and I've so much thought of that trip that Jerry and I took to see the eclipse in the middle of the country, just having this eclipse come again. It really took me back to it. And I did go to totality this time again.
One of the things that's also great about your book is dealing with an unreliable narrator. Now, fiction writers will often craft an unreliable narrator, and then you're, talented Mr. Ripley like.
Right.
But what was a singular challenge
Mm.
that you had that you think is a good example of you having to investigate something that we maybe haven't touched on that she said or that you uncovered that was like you said, an exemplar of trying to get this story, get
Well,
wrap around the story?
I think a really good example of what you're talking about, I mentioned how when I confronted her, so I was doing the movie with her, so I had to go to confront Jerry, and that's chapter 1 about being June Cobb. I had to sit with her in the most fascinating conversation of my life. Are you June Cobb? Have you ever used the name June Cobb? I was trying to pin her down. She said no in a very interesting way, and then she knew just a whole lot about June Cobb. So it was really fascinating to, wow, got a lot of light coming in here. It was really fascinating to hear her tell the story. But then she proceeded, in this conversation, I eventually said, well, you know what I think June might have done, since she had a plane, right? June Cobb supposedly flew a plane. And I said, I think she might have flown into the Redbird Airport in Dallas. And Jerry said, and Jerry got incredibly tearful and emotional. And of course, I tell it better in the book, but she placed herself there. She said, no, I flew that plane into the Redbird Airport. And all of a sudden, she's placing herself in Dallas on the day of the assassination. Now, I was already thinking if she has a double identity, she's going to be lying, concealing. So you're looking for lies. But I've interviewed a lot of people. You can't, you're not a human lie detector, but I've interviewed people for my television job, for documentaries, films. So I have a lot of experience. And when somebody tells an incredibly emotionally charged story, right? Well, just to give you an example, I have literally directed Marcia Gay Harden, an actress, as a lead in my movie, and Marcia has an Oscar. And she's a really, really, really good actress. And I've directed Liam Neeson. So I've directed some great actors, and I know what acting looks like, what great acting looks like, right? It's not perfect. It's good. They take a number of takes. Some takes are better than others, right? Even for the best of the best, they warm up, they ease into it. They're not, so I know what great acting looks like, and it is amazing, right? But there are some things that you look for, and what a director does is you look for those things where it wasn't as authentic, and you ask your actor to maybe try it again a little bit differently. Something didn't emotionally add up, or in some other way logistic. If they add improv a line, maybe it doesn't fit with the rest of the story. So well, we can't have that line in there. That's not where we're headed in the next scene. So in the same way, when Jerry told me she was in Dallas, and she was trying to get out of Dallas, the amount of emotion of her wanting to get out of Dallas and get her plane in the air before she believed the airspace was going to shut down, the visceral energy coming off of her when she told me that story, I mean, there's just no doubt in my mind that she was there, right? There's no doubt in my mind. I could feel the triggering nature of her retelling that story. I actually feel a little triggered retelling the story of this conversation. You might probably see it
You're
much
kind of, I can
right
hear
now.
you choke, like tighten up
It's
a little
so
bit.
intense, this conversation, right? Where she
Yeah.
placed herself in Dallas, to me to even talk about it now. So when you're telling something like that, it starts to have that energy. But then Jerry said, because I was like, well, when you heard the president was shot, she claimed she was there with a bunch of journalists. That's why she'd flown to Dallas with Life magazine reporters. Well, then she tried to say, and she said this very flatly without emotion, that no, they didn't go into Dallas to cover the news story. Well, it doesn't take Albert Einstein to realize that that does not add up, that Life magazine reporters would go into Dallas to cover that particular story, right? So I mean, you just take a look at things like that and you go, the emotion of the story was truthful. She had a tremendous amount of details that lined up to witness testimony of what they saw on the airplane that they described. So you look for corroboration. But then if there's a gaping hole in the story, where was she right when the president died? Why was she really just sitting in that plane all afternoon like she told me? That didn't sound right to me, or I think anybody who hears that story would think that doesn't sound right, right? So yeah, that's how I started to piece it together. I did not take her say so at face value. And frankly, I didn't take I think far too many of these JFK researchers and others take these documents at face value. I believe the documents themselves are crafted with some misdirections to conceal top secret material. And, in the famous British Enigma, when the Brits decoded the Nazi communications, this has been written about, they could never say they had done that. So when they made documents that went out to the field, to the generals, and how we're going to respond in the war, they had to attribute that information from decoding the German machine called the Enigma. When they broke the code, they could never say we broke the code. They have to attribute it to someone. We heard from this guy, or we tracked this submarine and we now know this. They had to make up stories that were false written into those documents to cover their sources. So I looked at some of these things happening in the assassination program and took that with a grain of salt also. So it's not an easy task to try to untangle lies. But if you have a cheating husband, you also trust the lipstick on the collar more than the story that they were working late. I mean, there are some tried and truisms that you can follow, right? And common sense that does lead you to certain conclusions.
Well, that leads me to there are a couple of questions, but I do want to make sure we give a little shout out to Babushka, because that is such an important part of the story. And no book on JFK is complete without an analysis of the film footage. And I knew that you were onto something, because you're able to put your skills in film as a cinematographer and as a director and editing, that you were going to be able to really get something there. And I like how the photographs and the stills in the book and throughout the book, it's not just Babushka. Could you tell us a little bit about that? Because Jefferson Morley, he quibbled with you, and I have to say, folks, if you go and check out the interview between Mary and Jefferson Morley about her book, then you'll see somebody who's, now Jefferson knows a lot, and you held your own as, like you called yourself, a newbie with him, and that's no small feat. What did you find, and what do you think? It's a theory. You even said as much, but what do you think you see there?
Well, first of all, I very much describe in the book why. I mean, I've just said about how Jerry placed herself in Dallas in what sounded like almost a getaway flight, trying to get out of Dallas after she's a pilot. So she's trying to pilot a plane out of there under extreme duress. And June Cobb being on, what appeared to be an assassination unit for the CIA, and Jerry having a false identity. I mean, obviously, I started to worry about the worst. And there are a lot of other reasons that I started to worry about what was Jerry doing there in this story that she told me. And was it true that she sat with reporters all day on a tarmac, which is what she told me, and didn't go into Dallas to cover the event, which made no sense whatsoever. So obviously I started to wonder if she went into Dallas, right? That was the hole in her story. And so I looked for her in the film footage, and I knew her look. So I'd studied her for years, and how she looked in the vintage photos and newsreels. I had so many images of her. She's burned in my brain as the filmmaker doing her story. So I looked at all the footage on Dealey Plaza and all the other locations that day in Dallas too, looking for a woman who had her stature, height, weight, look, hair, that kind of thing. And I didn't see her until the very end, when the motorcade goes through Dealey Plaza. And I'm so thankful that I didn't see her. I wasn't hoping to see her at all. But I did find something extremely disturbing, and unfortunately something that's been terribly understudied, which was that there's a woman named the Babushka Lady. And this woman wears a headscarf, so she's, that's why she got the name Babushka. She wears literally a trench coat like a spy. She's in a brown trench coat. She has a big camera. Jerry described to me having movie cameras and other cameras in the plane, the cover with the Life magazine people. So Jerry's supposed to be there with cameras this day. That's what she told me. So now a woman with a camera who appeared to me to possibly have the blonde ponytail about Jerry's size. This woman is aiming intently at the motorcade as Kennedy drives by. And it's just very upsetting, because when I looked into the footage, first of all, the woman walked away from Dealey Plaza, never to come forward. They went after Zapruder's footage, but no one went after her footage. She just disappeared into history. She never told her story. Her footage was never found. She's one of the greatest mysteries of all time, and she literally makes the list on the web of greatest mystery of all time. Babushka Lady, who was she? Well, it crossed my mind she could be Jerry, or even some other person Jerry had flown in there, but certainly could be Jerry. And that was extraordinarily concerning when I manipulated and I have this on my website, womaniknow.com. I have links to the film footage where you can stabilize shaky footage of the Babushka woman to see what she's actually doing as the president drives by. And unfortunately, what she's doing, and nobody ever discovered this before, you're looking for shooters on the grassy knoll, you're looking for people, ne'er-do-wells on the plaza. Why didn't we look at the Babushka woman who just walked out of there, and she should be a person of interest? I would just say, could a woman be 20 some feet away from a president, aiming a big camera at the president at the moment his head exploded, and she walked away into history, never ever to be questioned or heard from again? Well, she should be a person of interest in, and you're looking for, did Oswald have collaborators? Were you looking for, is there another shooter? And in that era, it was not beyond capability. There were lipstick guns. There were guns in canes that had been from earlier in the century. Concealed weapons were not a stretch as far as technology is concerned. So the footage of the Babushka was very creepy because the president's coming in his motorcade. And of course, the picture you want to get is him and Jackie coming towards you. Now, they've just been shot through his neck, the first shot. And Babushka, very bizarrely, turns her camera and points this way. President is still coming here. And she stays aiming towards a spot in space, right where nothing is, until the president goes into her line of sight. And at that point, that's when he is struck in the head with a fatal shot. Those things I've just told you are not crazy. They are shown in the imagery that I've presented online, and they're just there. And it's also proven that this woman walked out of there. Now, Jefferson Morley, no JFK person, anybody who studied the case, this idea that the Babushka could be up to no good in any way, shape, or form, that she should have been questioned, no one's brought this forward, or that even looked at the fact that, well, if you're looking for a shooter in the grassy knoll, which is actually a terrible ballistic angle to shoot from, you'd have shot right into a crowd of people. So if you missed the president, you could hit people. Babushka's shooting into the grassy knoll, which, if you know anything about pistols, that's your good backstop, right? Your pistol goes into the dirt, your bullet. So, wow, why wasn't this looked at, right? I became very concerned about this. So I confronted Jerry as directly as I possibly could, and I confronted her about not going in, and was that true? And did she go in with a camera to shoot the president? The word shoot can have a lot of meanings. And you can see in the book, it's the end of the book, what she said. I can't tell you that I felt particularly calmed and secure in the way she responded to that question and how she answered it. But I became concerned that Jerry, A, could be the Babushka, and the Babushka could be a very troubling figure. And if you're looking for another shooter, I'm not saying for sure that the Babushka is another shooter or she is nefarious. I'm saying for absolute sure, whoa, why wasn't she looked at? She should be a person of interest, and knowing what we know today about women's capabilities, because that's why she wasn't looked at. And frankly, in 1960, they didn't think a woman could be capable of anything like that. We know better today what women are capable of, good and bad. And so in that regard, I think it should be revisited. And that was the toughest thing for me to put in the book. I mean, in so many levels, I did not want to put that theory out there. At the same token, it's probably why I wrote the book, right? Because once that crosses your mind, and I said this to Jefferson Morley, it didn't surprise me that the JFK researchers are all going to be against that theory at first, because if you believe Oswald did it alone, you don't like that theory. And if you're one of the longstanding people who's researched the assassination and you didn't ever ask what she was up to, whoops, maybe you should have. And also, it's just never been out there. It's such a glaring oversight. It's hard to, I think it's hard to wriggle out, for any researcher to wriggle out of the fact that that should have been looked at. The other theories of shooters coming from all these long distances in other directions is nowhere near, if you were to plan a crime, nowhere near as elegant a solution. So it should have been on the table. It should have been discussed. It should have been looked at by the FBI originally. It should have been a whole lot of things that it wasn't. And so I felt I needed, as wild as it is to talk about it, to bring that into the book and bring it to the page.
Well, I'm certainly so glad you did it. There's a question about from Patricia in the chat. If you look at a picture online of Oswald in Mexico City, it doesn't look like him. Why would someone want to impersonate him, or was this a ruse to meet with June Cobb?
Very interesting question. There's, in my book, you can only do so much. It's already pretty thick, right? So
Yeah.
I was trying to, a lot of people have written about Oswald and really studied him, and I came at it from my angle. But there are a lot of theories about Oswald. And I came to really feel pretty strongly that Oswald's trip to Moscow in the late 1950s, where he lived there for a year and a half, that to me looks a lot like he was an intelligence dangle, they call it, right? That he was a probe, that he was possibly a false defector. And I make a case for that. I'm certainly not the first person to make that case. I think that's been very suspiciously eyed by a lot of people. What was Oswald doing? And was Oswald in intelligence? If Oswald was in intelligence, and with what I discovered about how June and Jerry were doubled, because as you'll learn in the book, it's not a simple case that Jerry is June. No, there is a woman named June Cobb using that name who is not Jerry. And you'll learn a lot about what I uncovered about how identities can be borrowed. And that seems to me to be the name of the game. Borrowing. Patricia, if I went to Cuba and I used your name and you let me do that, right? Then you are really alibying me for anything I'm doing over there and come back. And, it's just a great alibi if two people are working together in that way as agents, which both would be, a team. So I think it's very possible, but I have not deeply looked into it to write my own book on it, that, Oswald may well have been played in some of those ways. But like I said, I'm not the first person to come out with that. Tons of people have. I think there's a lot of smoke there. And I hope my book sheds a lot of light, because I put under a microscope how one of these that I'm finding, one of these doubling, how it really works, right? And I think what I've uncovered can be a template for other researchers to hopefully look at Oswald and look at some other people about how, how that can actually work on the ground.
And then we have from Naomi, how long did it take for you to write this book? And could you give an example of what were your key sources?
Well, Jerry was obviously sourced directly, but as we've talked about, I didn't totally believe her. It took me, I think, the writing process. Now, I had to keep my filmmaking business going too, right? The research part and knowing Jerry and, the whole 9 yards, I think of it as a 12-year journey of knowing Jerry, thinking I was doing the astronaut film, starting to learn these documents, figuring out who she was. And then the writing of the book, I think, was about 3-year process, while I also, kept my filmmaking career going as much as I could with all this.
Right.
So the writing, I think, was 3 years, but yeah, and the sources, tremendous number of sources. I think I have 1,600 footnotes in the book. It's crazy. National Archives was huge. I traveled all over the country to special collections. I bet you I visited over 50 or more, and I didn't even cite every one if it wasn't directly cited. Special collections, aviation collections, presidential libraries were very helpful. So I went to always direct, documents, primary sources, basically.
Well, we are at the top of the hour, and I just want to tell people, really, we scratched the surface of a woman I know, and I really want to encourage you to take this book in and really absorb all of the details, the fascinating twists and turns, and how Mary so deftly handled the challenges of this unreliable narrator, and then this new area of work for Mary as she called herself, the newbie. And that's part of what brings fresh eyes to it. And history needs that. We need that contribution. And I think it's been so important also that you have made some breakthroughs in this story. And so what's next? You're working on your film about Pennsylvania, but any ideas about another book?
I do have a few. I haven't, I gave myself, because we put the book debuted in November, and I've been doing some PR things like this and some signings and stuff, and loving doing that. I love the book community, by the way. It's a really cool world. But I gave myself till summer to decide, to this summer to decide. I have several tributaries from this story into other Cold War stories and things that at the time we go, well, there's another great story, right? So I came across things that would be tangents and offshoots. Um, but I haven't quite decided. I'm getting back into my filmmaking a bit with this documentary and taking a breather from this heavy lift that was this particular project. But I enjoyed doing a book so much that I think another book will most likely be in my future.
Well, I'm looking forward to it. And I know everybody here is really just so delighted to hear that's the great news that you'll do another book. And the Cold War is such a rich area to explore. And you've done something that any historian or any amateur investigator of this time period would envy. And you've uncovered something that is new and fresh and gives us different insights. And I want to thank you so much, Mary Haverstick, for being here with Malaprop's virtual author event. Please come back. Please let us know what you're doing, and we appreciate your time and for being here.
Well, Patricia, thank you. You guys are so gracious. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone, for being here.